Party Chairman and North West MEP Nick Griffin. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. Well, it's a good mixture here of faces of newcomers and old hands. And perhaps a good chunk of what I've got to say tonight really is a bit more directed towards the old hands. But as regards basic policy things like this, we'll do a question and answer session then, so that's the time that's more for the newcomers. So I want to talk about nationalism, and those of you who've been in it or watching it for a long time, you'll probably have seen that sometimes somewhere in Europe, whether it's Britain or France or somewhere, sometimes nationalism really seems to be the thing of the moment, and other times it seems to drift back. And you think, because we invest so much hope and energy and commitment to our cause, that when you see it go back somewhere, you think, oh, what has got to happen before people wake up? How the hell are we going to turn things around? If they can't see this now already, then what is going to happen? And what I want to talk about really is the way that it's the right way to look at what goes on. Because nationalism, I think most people understand, if you look at the really big picture, say immigration, you'll find that in every single country in Europe, it's not just in Britain, in every country in Europe they've got similar problems to us, one way or another. In every country in Europe their elite have let them down. And in every country in Europe, this is the good bit, people are fighting back and campaigning about it and complaining about it and wanting something done about it. And immigration and the problems it causes are constantly at the top of the political agenda all over Europe. Now, if no one gave a damn, if the public weren't concerned, then we'd really be banging our head against a brick wall. But the fact is that people do give a damn all over Europe. So nationalism, our ideas, it's something that's coming. All over Europe, if you went back, say, 10 years, lots of people thought the European Union, I don't quite understand it, but I think it's probably good. There's virtually no one out there, no normal people now, who've got a moment's nothing good to say about the European Union. Everyone knows that it's taken away our freedom, it's taken away our identity, it's taken away our economic sovereignty, our rights to run our own country, to suit ourselves. And everyone in Britain knows it, everyone in Greece certainly knows it, everyone in Germany knows it because they're paying for the Greeks and everything. So all over Europe, again, ideas that we were talking about years ago, that the European Union will end up destroying national identity and sovereignty and being a disaster. Everybody's got that as well. So how I view nationalism, actually, it's a bit like a tide that's coming in. And if you stood on a beach or some mud flats when the tide's out and you look out, especially those of you from Fleetwood, Blackpool and so on, you watch there, the tide goes out and out and out. And you see all this mud or sand left there, and when's it going to come back in? And it doesn't come in a sudden rush. It never comes in a tsunami, does it? Not around the coast of Britain. It comes in a different way. It comes in because just as it reaches the very depth of the ebb, you see one little wave come in a little bit higher up the beach or the mud flats than the wave before. And you think, oh, the tide's turned, if you're waiting for the tide to come in, so the kids can swim or whatever. And then the next wave isn't quite as high. And you think, oh, was I wrong? But then a couple more waves later, it's coming a bit further up the beach. And as you watch it, if instead of thinking about that one moment, if you look at it over a longer period, you see that the tide has turned, and each wave, on average, comes in higher, even though sometimes they drop back. And that's what's happening in Europe right now. And our cause is part of a tide that's coming in. And I want to give a few examples of the way that it seems to ebb and flow, but actually it's always coming forward. First thing, at present, if you think about nationalism in Europe at the moment, whether you read it even in the mainstream press, or particularly if you're looking on the internet, you see it's all about the Front National. Over in France, Marine Le Pen is pushing, quite likely to be in the runoff in the French presidential elections. That's a party really very much like ours, pushing for actual national power in a really big way. Now, as a matter of fact, Marine Le Pen is not going to become the next president of France. I'm sorry to say. I think it's highly, highly unlikely. She's quite likely to come second to the socialist candidate and to knock Sarkozy out because he's so unpopular and get into the second round. But one reason that actually the French media are really quite happy with that. In fact, the French media in the last few months have been quite nice to the Front National, in a way they're not, say, with us, because the French media is as socialist as the BBC is, and they actually want to have Marine Le Pen as the candidate in the runoff. Because they know that if the socialist is against the nationalist, then every single anarchist who normally perhaps wouldn't back a moderate socialist party. Every single communist crazy who perhaps normally wouldn't, they'll be on their side. And almost every immigrant will come out to vote as well. Many of them will vote twice. There'll be a huge effort to keep the nationalists out, and it will actually boost the socialist vote, and certainly keeps the sort of the more moderate Gaullist Tory types out. So that's what's going on there. So the Front National is doing really well. They could well get into that runoff, but they won't win in the end. And then people will think, oh dear, that's a shame, isn't it? And the Front National could well hit some tough times after that. But the important thing in terms of the waves up the beach is it will have shown people all over Europe that actually a nationalist party like the Front National or like us, that we can compete for national power and be taken really seriously and be backed by perhaps 25% of the population. So even though the Front National wave will go back a bit, overall, nationalism will advance because more and more people will think, well, if the French could nearly do it, perhaps we can nearly do it. And it'll give people heart and hope all over Europe. So it looks like the Front National is this huge thing. How can we compare ourselves to that? Well, why do you think it's called the Front National? Because in British, exactly. In British, that says National Front. Because the Front National was founded in 1970 by a handful of French nationalists who were in despair about their own country. They thought they could never get anywhere. And they looked at Germany, and there was no nationalism effectively there. They looked at Italy, the same, at Denmark. They looked all over Europe. And there's no one that they could see as a model for the future in France until they looked across the Channel and they looked at the National Front in Britain, which had been founded a couple of years and had pulled all various different groups together and was doing really well. And the National Front in those days was nothing like the National Front that you think of in recent times. Basically sort of 120 skinheads and old chaps who've just been there for years and years, and they do nothing except drink and talk about the old days. It's going nowhere and everybody knows it. But the National Front in 1970 was a vibrant, lively organisation of decent people who were desperately worried about what's happening to our country, far-sighted people who could see long before most people could see what was happening in our country, and they were vilified and attacked by the far left and the media and everybody, as usual, in the way that we're used to. And so you look now and think, well, what was the purpose of the National Front? Well, quite a few people who are now in the British National Party cut their political teeth in it and learnt, and we learnt particularly from its mistakes, but also the Front National wouldn't have got itself together and so on, and certainly wouldn't have had that name if it hadn't been for that earlier British wave up the beach. And although that earlier wave of the tide turning was only a little ripple, it gave way and created, in some extent, the Front National. Another example, Jobbik, is in Hungary. It stands for the Movement for a Better Hungary. And I work very closely with several Jobbik MEPs. They're smashing people. They really are. It's a great organisation of people who are absolutely committed to their country. And some of the things they do are a bit different to ours because they have a different political culture. But nevertheless, it's a fine organisation. And if you look at Hungary now, you see something quite remarkable. Because in Hungary, the main political party, the government, is something a bit like UKIP. And the main opposition, the official opposition in Parliament, is Jobbik, something very much like us. Can you imagine Britain with Nigel Farage as the leader of the government and me as the leader of the opposition? You know, he'd still be a snake oil salesman, don't get me wrong. Very slick, slimy one, but very good at it. But nevertheless, he'd be running the country and we'd be the opposition. And that's the position in Hungary. But 3 years ago, just after Jobbik had first been founded, they came to Britain and talked to us, and one of the things they were most impressed by was bnptv. And to this day, if you look on their website, and one of the things which has carried Jobbik forward is the fact that their website, like ours, is more popular than all the political parties' websites in Hungary, in the case of Jobbik, or in Britain in our case. It's one of the things that carried them forward, and they modelled their website on us. And they modelled in particular their TV operation on bnptv. So 3 or 4 years ago, they were looking at the British National Party thinking, we wish we were there. Because at that point, our wave was higher up the beach than theirs. And now their wave's streets ahead of ours. But this is what happens when the tide comes in. The last example on this is Forza Nuova. This is in Italy. Now this is run by a very old friend of mine, Roberto Fiore. And he founded Forza Nuova some years back. And they've got to the point now where they have about 8,000 members. Very, very similar to us. 3,000 of those are committed, hardcore activists who, with respect to all our activists, I know there's plenty here tonight, are a different level on average to our activists. They really are committed and it's a tremendous amount they ask before someone is officially called a militant in that party. They've got a tremendous machine, illustrated by the fact that they've got 85 local headquarters, each of them operating, as a place like this. Some of them as clubs, some of them operating as a place where youngsters come in and play gigs, others where members of the public can come in and get advice. They run them as advice centres. Can you imagine the British National Party with 85 advice centres? That's a wave way up the beach from where we are. But on the other hand, their vote in every recent election has been something like 0.03% in the whole of Italy. We get more votes in Manchester than they get in the whole of Italy. So it's a rather strange thing, and for years they've looked at us and thought, well, whatever we've got in terms of a good solid base, we wish we were where the British National Party is in terms of public support, and we're just not. But then, about a year ago, I'd mentioned to Roberto, 2 years ago, I'd mentioned to him about the fuel strike in 2001, when, as you know, if you think back, the hauliers and the farmers in this country nearly brought the Blair government to destruction before it had done almost any of the damage that it finally went on to do. A fantastic struggle which imposed immense hardship on ordinary people, all of us, any drivers or anyone who found the supermarket shelves were empty and so on. But nevertheless, that protest, as you know, was supported by almost everybody in Britain who understood that, this is inconvenient, but the important thing is to get those buggers out and to teach all the politicians a lesson about just piling taxes and taxes and taxes and taxes on all the rest of us and thinking that no one's ever going to do anything more than complain. And when the hauliers and the farmers hit back, it really was quite something. And I mentioned this to Roberto a couple of years ago and told him about it and the lessons we'd learnt. And then last year I was with him down in Sicily. If you remember, if you've seen on the website, I went over to Lampedusa, which is a small island right on the African coast, through which thousands of African refugees and bogus asylum seekers were pouring every single month. And I went and saw how, although we weren't really told about it, over there the Italians were putting them into holding centres and keeping them there for a couple of weeks while they found out if they had papers. Because if they had papers, they could send them back to where they came from, and if they didn't, they couldn't. Guess what? No, me no speak Italian, me no papers, me no telling you where I came from. At which point the Italians couldn't send them back, bizarrely enough. So they came up with a better idea from the Italian point of view, actually. They simply gave them 50 euros and they gave them a bus ticket, a one-way bus ticket from the south of Italy to Calais, and said, Britain's that way, Manchester's that way, Salford's that way, the office where you sign on's that way, the place where they'll pay to keep you warm in winter while their own pensioners freeze to death, it's that way. So that's what they were doing. So I saw this and so on, and while I was there in Sicily, Roberto and I met a small group of very radical farmers. They're people, obviously, almost literally, rooted in the soil, rooted in the land, in traditions, and things that have to be done slowly over seasons or over years. They're not given as a group to sudden sweeping changes. But nevertheless, the farmers in Sicily had absolutely had enough. For this reason. A few years ago, the banks were going to the farmers in Sicily, saying, look, you're rather backward, you're inefficient, you could modernise, we're going to lend you lots of money. And some of the farmers are saying, well, actually, thanks, we're okay, we're just farming the way we had done for years. And the banks were then saying, but your neighbours are modernising, other farmers on the islands are modernising. If you can't boost your production, they'll simply end up buying you out. So you borrow money off us and you modernise to keep up with the Joneses, or you're probably going to lose your farm anyway. So lots of farmers, perhaps foolishly, you can understand why, they were pushed, and the banks, there was all sorts of special deals, so they were pushed to borrow money. And they were pushed to get hugely into debt on farms that had been in their families for generations. Literally, not just their father and their grandfather, but going back and back and back, great-great-great-grandfather, hundreds of years, these farms in their families. And the banks persuaded, strong-armed them into giving them these farms as collateral against the loans. And, well, that was it. They started producing rather more. But in the last few years, the European Union has turned round and in something that will be very familiar to people in all sorts of industry in Britain, as to what happens next, they signed free trade or trade liberalisation agreements with the countries of North Africa, which also produce olives and lemons and oranges and courgettes and tomatoes, the same as the farmers of Sicily were producing. But the difference is the farmers of Sicily have to pay European level taxes, and as you know, they're pretty high. They have to pay European level prices. They have to pay European wages to their labourers, and they've got families to keep at European rates, kids to send to Europe to universities at European cost rates, the same as ours. They're burdened with all of this. And how can they compete when suddenly they're told you've got to compete with produce from Morocco, where the average agricultural wage is €5 a day? Not €5 an hour, €5 a day. With the result of which, all of a sudden, the Sicilian farmers found that they simply couldn't compete. So when it happens in Britain and a factory can't compete, the jobs are lost and the equipment's shipped abroad to somewhere in the Far East, and then we ship the goods back. Well, in the case of Sicily, quite simply, the farmers go bust, and the banks then come in and say, well, don't worry about the money you owe us. Don't worry. We'll just take your farm. And that's happened a huge amount. And naturally, the Italian temperament of the Sicilian farmers, I think, is probably a little bit more excitable than that of the average Brit. With the result, they said enough is enough. And Roberto and I talked with them, and we were talking about various things that could be done. And this possibility came up. And they pricked their ears up, and they made a few notes, and they went away again. And a few months ago, they came to Roberto and said, right, we are ready to start work on a fuel protest about what's happened to us in Sicily. Will you help us? And Roberto and his activists obviously said yes, and they put together a campaign. And this is something, perhaps for newcomers, who might think, well, you know, I understand there's something a bit wrong with the BBC, but I guess they tell us the truth, sort of. Well, not one word of what I'm about to tell you has appeared in any British news outlet, and yet it's a huge story. A huge, huge story. That what they did was they said, we are going to blockade Sicily. Sicily is a big island. It's a big, big place. A significant chunk of Italy. It's much bigger, say, than the Isle of Wight. They said, we're going to blockade it, and we're going to bring it to a standstill. And they did. They brought the whole of Sicily to a standstill with their blockade. And just as here in 2001, ordinary people are so angry with the government and their taxes that despite the inconvenience, they said, we'll have some of that too. We're on the side of the protesters. And a combination of farmers and lorry drivers and nationalist activists launched a protest which spread all the way across southern Italy, and in the end involved 100,000 people. 100,000 people with convoys of combine harvesters, combines of tractors, combines of lorries in ordinary cars. A massive protest that brought huge chunks of southern Italy to a standstill. And it hasn't been reported by any media news outlet anywhere outside of Italy. For the simple reason they don't want people thinking, oh, that's very interesting, and thinking we could do that. And I'll tell you what, people are going to be near to doing that very soon. Because as an aside, it's highly likely, according to news reports in the United States, which we haven't seen, and according to word inside the City of London, people who actually really know what's going on, that fuel prices are going to go up 50% by May. That's as a consequence of this insane warmongering against Iran. But that's what they're expecting. They're expecting, without it going off into war, if it goes off into war, it'll go off the scale. Just in terms of tension, they're expecting fuel prices to go up 50% over the next 3 or 4 months. And I think that will probably spark a huge wave of protests, which I hope we will be involved in. If I had to promise you, we're going to do our very best to get involved in. And that's why the media and the political elite have wanted to keep quiet what happened in Italy. But what happened in Italy was partly because of what experience we'd had here, and the fact that nationalists working together had exchanged ideas. So, you know, they're higher up the beach than us. But I'm absolutely sure that if the hauliers and farmers and public of Britain decide we're going to do it, well, it was done in 2001, the same thing will happen there. And we can be involved in that and leading that from the front, and then our wave will come in further up the beach. Because all these parties, if you went back to about 2007 to 2009, the leaders of all these parties were looking at the British National Party and how our wave are coming up the beach. Because they all understand that we face an electoral system which is much harder to crack, to beat, to get through than a lot of theirs. They all understand that. So when they saw us winning council seats first past the post, when they saw us winning a seat on the Greater London Assembly and getting MEPs elected as well, they thought, well, the British National Party have achieved something really remarkable. They understood that more than most people do in Britain. because they've been fighting the same kind of fights, and they see that especially with the electoral system, we're up against it more than most of them. If you're in Italy, you haven't got... Immigration is becoming a problem in Italy, but you haven't got huge swathes of Italian cities, like huge swathes of Manchester, where there's no British National Party vote, because there's no British people left anymore. That's the kind of problem they haven't got. So they know that we did really well. And in about 2007 to 2009, lots of them were thinking, oh, I wish I was leading the British National Party, because their way is so much further up the beach. And since 2009, I spent most of my time thinking, I wish I was leading anything but the British National Party, because as you know, we've been through some fairly hard times. And I'm here tonight really to tell you that those hard times are finished. We've turned it around. There's one more nasty bit coming, and whether you're an old hand or a newcomer alike, steel yourself for this, and I'm going to tell you because it's going to be there. We've just submitted our 2010 accounts to the Electoral Commission, and they are appalling. They're a true horror, a picture of disaster, showing us some £870,000 in debt. Well, compare that with the Front National 4 or 5 years ago, 13 million euros in debt. It's about 11.5 million quid. And there were serious concerns over whether the Front National would survive. Then, it's very clear now the Front National has survived. And so if you looked at their figure of 13 million euros in debt, you'd understand, but it's 4 or 5 years ago, they've got over it, it doesn't matter. Well, similarly, those accounts of 2010, it is what it says on the label. They're the accounts from 2010. They're a snapshot of a particularly hard period where a combination of overreach and mistakes and being ripped off, all of them added to give us that disaster. But the point is, it's been turned around. One of the reasons that they're late is that those accounts now have been kept back for long enough so that within a couple of months of them being in and published, last year's accounts will be in and published. And those will show a huge turnaround, with debts down to a couple of 100,000. Still a lot, but heading in the right direction. And I can tell you this now, it's the first time I've done it for our website, but it ain't going to be a secret very much longer, that by 2012, when these accounts are in for this year, the end of this year, they will show that in 2 years, we turn this party around. Clive Jefferson in particular has been the man involved in turning this party around and cutting and negotiating and haggling and getting things right for a change. We turned it around from being £870,000 in debt to being in the black. By the end of this year, this party's accounts will show the reality of the situation, that we are back in the black. I can promise you that. So now we start to rebuild, and I can tell you that I believe that the political turnarounds will be every bit as dramatic as the financial turnaround, because it was true that we were very heavily in debt, and it was a huge problem, and there was a time when the British National Party might not have survived. It's not the case now, but that was true. But the same people who made a great meal and a great song of dance out of that, trying to make it definitely happen, were also saying at the same time the British National Party is a toxic brand, that nobody loves us, everybody hates us. We're the political equivalent of Millwall Football Club, and that's it. It's all over by the shouting. And that was always a lie. We were never a toxic brand. The week after the Question Time programme, which was the apogee, the very peak of the BNP's attempt to demonise us, the week after I was ritually lynched on television, our support amongst the public, in opinion polls, was showing up as 24% of the British public prepared, saying, we'll now consider voting British National Party. And that was actually because the BBC and the whole political elite, because that was a gang operation, that Labour Party, Tories, Lib Dems and the BBC, all in it absolutely interlocked. And they misread the public in a huge, huge way. And they spent the first half of the programme trying to show that we were extremists and I was a, quote, fascist, unquote, which I think to most ordinary people, they probably didn't succeed. But in any case, that was the first half. And they wouldn't let me speak. And in fact, all ordinary people remember is the fact that I just couldn't get a word in edgeways, and it was hugely unfair. And then the second half of the programme, they did something different. And as you know, Question Time is supposed to be about things like transport, or the Greek debt crisis, if it was this week, or the potential war against Iran and what it would do to Britain. But as you know, in that case, Question Time was rather different. And instead, when they finally let me speak in the second half, they let me speak for a bit. They basically asked me, well, what do you say about immigration? And I told them a little bit about where we stand on immigration. Namely, that the country is full, the multicultural experiment has been a disaster, that it's going to lead to horrible problems, and something's got to be done to sort the mess out. And they clearly regarded what I said as that's okay. He's condemned himself. He's shown how he's a racist. So the general public looked at what I was allowed to say and listened to it and thought, bloody right. He's absolutely right. Yeah. And then they moved on from that, because the left have this mantra, say that we're fascist, which we're not, that we're racist, which we're not, that we're Islamophobic. Well, a phobia is an irrational fear of something, like a fear of little spiders. But to be afraid of a bloody great poisonous tarantula is not irrational. Similarly with Islam. So I'm afraid of Islam because I have 3 lovely daughters. Well said. Yeah, but I'm not irrationally afraid of that monstrosity. I understand what it means to women's rights, to decent treatment for animals, to freedom of speech and so on. It's a different way of running the world which is not compatible with our way of running the world. And that I was pretty much allowed to say, because they wanted me to condemn myself as Islamophobic. And of course they listened to what I said and thought Islamophobia. But nearly 10 million people watching it, 3 times the normal audience, listened to it and thought bloody good common sense. I agree with him. And then they finally, the other bit of course, they say that we're homophobic. So the one little bit of news we discussed was the fact that several weeks before, some gay pop star had died of AIDS, I think it was, and wasn't that tragic, and what do we think of that? And fundamentally there I said, well, yes, it's obviously that's a shame. It's not really news. And I ended up saying that the point about homosexuality is that the party doesn't have a view. We don't believe that any political party or government has the right to go peering into people's bedrooms and private lives. And a state which has the power to interfere in people's sex lives is a state which is far too powerful. It's a threat in all sorts of ways if it's got that much power. But our position is simply that it's not something that should be flaunted abroad, and it's certainly not something that should be taught to 4 and 5-year-old children in our schools who shouldn't know anything about any sex, let alone homosexuality. And millions of British people watching me say that did exactly that. Finally, common sense about this issue on television. But the executives and the BBC and the politicians thought, oh, he's condemned himself as homophobic. It's a full house. It's the lot. It's a jackpot. Racist, fascist, homophobic, Islamophobic. That's it. Game over. But no, it wasn't. Because to their horror, when the opinion polls came out, we got potentially 24% of the population. Can you imagine what would happen if they'd given me the 4 extra question times, which we should have had since, to which we were entitled if they'd obeyed their own rules? And the public had seen the British National Party view on things such as the Afghan war. It's nothing to do with us. Bring the boys home now, for example. Such as bailouts to the banks. Why should we bail them out for their own stupidity and their own corruption? Let them sink and let's have a decent, honest financial system which puts their own people first. Say those things and our support will be through the roof. So that's the position. We were never a toxic brand. That was a myth by various knockers and leftist infiltrators and state informers and people who were just ambitious to get their own little crack at running a nationalist political party. I don't really know why people want to do it. It's a horrible job at times. But they are. There are some people who are ambitious for it. They're never up for it because it's not an easy job either. But that's a different story. Anyway, on account of that, I can tell you the political turnaround is going to be huge and very rapid. Our votes have been lower recently. UKIP's votes have been through the floor recently. The Green Party's votes have been through the floor recently. There's something about the early stages of a recession where it always has this effect, that it makes people just think in terms of the 1 or 2 main political parties or give up on politicians. And the Labour Party have been winning seats only because, as I know Gary has hammered time and time again, they've been getting postal votes. So on a smaller turnout, their vote is rock solid. And that's why. And so we'd stop, instead of moaning about it or thinking, are they fiddling it? No, they're just working the system they designed to help them. But it can help us too if we have postal votes, if we collect lots and lots of postal votes. So there's a technique there which will help us. But most of all, we're going to be helped because we've got a great election coming up. Now, I'm very, very well aware that tonight we're in Manchester and that I'm an MEP for the northwest of England and that your concerns primarily are about your part of this green and pleasant land, which is some part of the northwest. I know that. And I also know we've got elections coming up, including the Manchester mayoral election candidate here. Salford mayoral election. And then the Manchester in November, we got the Manchester police chief election and so on. So there's plenty of elections coming up here. That I know. But there's no election in Britain this year as important, or certainly this May, as important as the Greater London Assembly election. It's crucial because, as most of you will know, we won a seat in that in 2008, and our winning candidate, Richard Barnbrook, in the end went off and took that seat away for himself and wouldn't give us the control that we expected, that our members expected, that our voters expected. So that's something which is wholly wrong. We need to put that right for our voters for a start. We need to show that the British National Party, where it's lost a seat through the wickedness of one of its own people, nevertheless it's determined to get the seat back for someone who will hold it for the British National Party and speak on behalf of British National Party voters. And the lead candidate that we've got in London for the list system, Steve Squire, he's a nationalist through and through. His father was imprisoned in the 1970s under the Race Relations Act, which says that telling the truth is no defence, for producing a banner and posters which had a red triangle on, as you get in, you can't come down this street, or whatever, and a picture in it, a silhouette, because it was about mugging. At the time, mugging was a huge problem in London. Mugging overwhelmingly of elderly ladies, pensioners, who were being turned over every single week at the bus stop outside the post office once they collect their pension, and some of them were just shaken. Some of them ended up with broken wrists, broken hips, ended up dying in hospital because they'd been mugged. And the overwhelming majority of the muggers were not Brits. They were relatively recent immigrants. And as the police statistics showed, and as this banner said, 80% of the muggers are black, 85% of the victims are white. Official police statistics. And Steve was responsible for putting that out. Steve's father, Keith Squire, was responsible for putting it out. And he was in prison for 6 months while Steve was a young lad. And he was bullied at school. He and his siblings were chased out of school. They had terrible problems. Steve went through that. So Steve knows what it's like to stand up for our people and for right and decency against the full might of the law and so on. He's in it eyes wide open. Most important of all, he has signed the form which says if he's elected, he will hold the seat for the British National Party. And if he doesn't, he resigns automatically. So we're not going to get another Richard Barnbrook. We're never going to have that problem anywhere ever again. It's sorted. People in London especially know we've got a really good candidate, so that's a good start. But it's really important that we win that seat. As I say, it's more important than all the others because it's such a high position. It's a really important position. And you might think, well, but what's it got to do with Manchester? What's it got to do with Swinton? It's to do with the fact that if we can retake that seat, it will show that despite everything that's been thrown at us, the British National Party is not just alive and kicking, but we're winners. It's really important. So tonight I'm here to ask for your help. And I know that you've got elections here yourself coming up, but tonight we want your help to help us to fund and push this campaign in London. And I'll tell you briefly, it's a bit shorter than what I've said to when I've been making the speech down in London for the last few days, why it's going to be such a good campaign. First of all, and why we're going to win. We won last time, we're going to win again. First of all, apart from having a better candidate and a better system, we've got Facebook on our side now. You'd have seen this leaflet, I think. It's on the tables and so on. This is the one that Gary here was responsible for, and a member of the public in Salford was responsible for bringing this scandal to our attention, where you've got asylum seekers being given their pre-Christmas top-ups on their energy bills when British pensioners are shivering or even freezing to death. And on the back of this leaflet, you may notice this strange little grey box. When I first saw it, I thought, what the devil is that? Some error at the printers, or something similar. But no, the strange little grey box is actually something, if you point your mobile phone at it and take a picture, it then automatically, the phone takes you through to the website that all the information is about this. And we're the first political party to have done this. It really is. It's going to become very common, but it's absolutely at the front of the game. And this isn't surprising, because as with all the other nationalist parties in Europe, one of the things we all have in common is that our websites together are more popular than those of all the other political parties put together. And on the back of that, in more recent times, we've also become really the kings and queens and princes of Facebook in political terms. We've all got enormous followings on Facebook. When we had, just in November, we organised a demonstration down in London, Protect the Poppy, against those crazed Muslim thugs who were threatening to burn the poppies in front of ex-servicemen on Remembrance Day in protest against the Afghan war and so on. And we organised a protest against that. And I was stunned by the fact that out of the people who turned up, about half of them, actually just under half of them, were there because they were firmly with the British National Party, because they were part of our official organisation, because an organiser had phoned them up and said, "Are you coming with us?" More than half of them were there because they'd seen it on Facebook, because friends had told them about it on Facebook, and they were there. And I was speaking in the European Parliament a couple of weeks ago. It was actually on the World at 8 newscast. I wrote a piece about it for them. And I was speaking to someone there from a very, very well-funded liberal left organisation, and they've been researching how Facebook is being used by nationalist parties all over Europe and how important it is to us. And he basically said he's seen nothing yet, because this thing has created the capability to produce huge numbers of people campaigning on a certain issue in a very short space of time with almost no resources, and the nationalists are at the head of the game, and really we're all very, very worried about it. Well, good stuff. Tremendous. And that's going to work to our advantage this year all over, but particularly in London, because we're pushing it really, really hard there as a trial run. And the lessons we learn from there will roll out, for instance, in the mayoral elections in November. So it's really important. You can only do a test run in one place at a time. So we're doing it in London. But the lessons we learn in London, with your help, are what lessons which will be rolled out to help people in the cause and the party in other parts of the country in due course. So that's a very important thing. The next thing is, you'll have seen, the members anyway, you'll have seen the leaflet in the last members' bulletin. We sent out the leaflet, the I Love London leaflet, as an example of the publicity material that we're putting out. And it's just a fantastic leaflet. The publicity design in this party now is second to none, and it's far better than what we had 4 or 5 years ago. So that's also going to come into effect in votes. We've got the truth truck. It's down in London consistently. I'm expecting it to get it back into the northwest of England for the campaign against race attacks on English boys fairly soon. It needs to be back up here, but it's out day after day in London at present. And again, it's really popular. There's no problems with it. It's getting a great response. We didn't have that last time around. We've got campaigns organised, or we're working on things down in London to use our activists more intelligently. One of the reasons people support this party, and perhaps we lost the edge a little bit when we really got elected to high positions such as MEP, they regard us as an anti-political party. We're not like the others. The others are based on big money and so on, and flash things like big billboards, and we're ordinary people. They've got their hands and their noses in the public purse and trough in so many different ways. And what we do, we fund ourselves. And if we, under those circumstances, produce big billboards, there's a vague point, that's what all the other parties do. It actually makes us rather like the other parties. That was a mistake. That was a mistake, in fact. And what I've been discussing with London activists is that we want to produce little or homemade banners on bed sheets from people supporting the British National Party in their own area, and put those up over road bridges and so on. And put placards, cheap placards, simple placards, around roundabouts and things like that, to show that it's local people, which it generally is, who support the British National Party, and it's not some distant thing which is just about money. And politicians just come along and preach from the television or look down from a big billboard like Big Brother. So that's in hand. That'll be a better campaign as well. We're going to be pushing really hard on the postal votes. And this is something where specifically we need your help, local organisers and so on, to arrange this. That the reason I'm an MEP more than anything else is that Clive Jefferson in 2008 understood just how important postal votes are. Either getting them for our own people, but also just appealing to people who've got postal votes. Because someone with a postal vote is 8 times more likely to vote than someone who hasn't. Which is why all of you at the end of this evening, I hope you've been asked this before, but if not, if this is the first time, I'm sure you'll be asked later on, all of you need to take this postal vote application form, 10 of them, home with you. Take 10 each and find friends and family and workmates and someone at the bus stop and sign them up as postal voters if they're sympathetic to the British National Party. And don't take no for an answer. No, I vote anyway. No, they don't. They're probably lying. Most people don't vote. I've seen time and time again in by-elections where there's houses with our posters all over the windows. and at 8 o'clock in the evening, you know from the list they still haven't voted. And you go and knock on their door and say, come on, come out. No, can't be bothered. No, the baby's in the bath. No, the dinner's in the oven. No, the cat's just been sick. Whatever it is. Any pitiful, awful excuse or genuine tiny reason for not voting. And they think it doesn't matter if the 3 people in this house don't go and vote, and then we miss winning the seat by 1 or 2 votes. Happens time and time again. If they got the postal vote, then we know they've got the postal vote 2 weeks before the election. We can go round and get it off them, basically. Say, have you filled it in? No, it's behind the mantelpiece. Get it off the mantelpiece, right. Get them to the mantelpiece and drag it off and get them to sign it and get it in the post. That's it. That's what the Labour Party do. That's why they're winning elections, even though they are so hugely unpopular. It's the thing that we've got to do. It's going to be rolled out in London in a big way. And in particular, London's one of the areas where they've done really well with the petition stalls. Bring Our Boys Home petition stalls. The referendum on the EU petition stalls. So we've got thousands of names of Londoners who've already signed up to us, and we're going to be sending them letters at the right moment saying, right, come along and vote for us. But if we send those letters in official franked envelopes, what does an official franked envelope, typewritten or computer printed, tell you if you're not really used to getting post? And most people these days don't get much post. It tells you either it's a bill or that it's a piece of junk mail trying to sell you something. Not interested in that either. It tells you that it's nothing really you either want or need to look at. And what we want to do is to get 35,000 hand-addressed envelopes. Hand-addressed. Because then, if it's hand-addressed, it's not from a business. It's not from someone trying to sell you something. It's someone writing to you personally. But to write that, we have to have 10 or 12 people in Salford in about 3 weeks' time, coming together for one evening with pots of tea or a few cans of lager, whatever you want to do, bottle of white wine or something, and some cheese, very Tory that, cheese and wine, and to sit there for the evening, having a chat, listen to a bit of music, and just writing out envelopes. That's all, to a list. Central office will be doing all the organisation, but we need your help. London needs that help, because it's the way forward. And we need to roll it out in London the first time around. What's the target of 35,000 about? Actually, it's 33,000. Well, because people are 8 times more likely to vote if they've got postal votes, if we hit 33,000 postal voters, it's the same as delivering 250,000 leaflets to ordinary homes. So it's a huge, intelligent use of activism. The Labour Party hasn't got many more activists than us, but they've learnt to use them very, very intelligently in terms of targeting their voters and pulling their vote in and forgetting about everybody else. They don't spend much more money in some elections now than we do, but they target it really, really effectively. And that's what we've got to do. And we're rolling these things out in London experimentally. Then we'll bring them back to the rest of the country as well. But we need your help to make a success of it. For London, we need your help here. And finally, all of you have seen Freedom, our paper. Increasingly effective. It really is a good piece of kit. Well, we're going to be producing a special 8-page Freedom aimed at Londoners. We'll send a copy to all our members and everyone else so you can see just how good it is. And we've got some fantastic deals lined up whereby we can produce 500,000 of those and get them distributed to all our best wards in London for £30,000. 500,000. It's a carpet bombing effect. Oh, bang. It's fantastic value. It really is. In our best areas, in the areas where our votes come from. So we are going to be investing some serious money in this campaign, as well as doing guerrilla tactics like homemade banners on bridges. We're going all out and we're going to be running a better campaign. And we should be able to win. It's very important that we do win. Because London, as you know, it's our capital city. It's this chance to get this seat back when they've all written us off. So it shows we're here, we are here to stay, and we're winners again. It's really, really important. Now you might think, well, what's the point of one seat on an assembly which has, 24 or 25 members? What does one seat do? Having one seat gives the fact that we are electable. Having one seat gives a voice. And the thing that upsets most British people is the fact we don't have a voice. There's no one there in the halls of power to speak up for us at all. And the things that our people need to give them back confidence is the fact that the British National Party has voices in serious levels of government, and once it's got a voice, it expresses itself well. which is something with our candidates down there this time around, we've really got the opportunity to do that. So it really does matter. And it matters because times are changing very drastically. Very drastically. The people, the other parties, the people running the BBC, the top police chiefs, they all know that this country is hugely unstable, that we've got a financial system which is ruined, wrecked, destroyed. It's just waiting to collapse. The whole Western financial system, it's finished. It's an appalling mess. And all the social and economic problems that will follow from that as well, they all know there's something horrible, truly horrible, just around the corner. And that's why they wanted to get rid of us for so desperately for the last couple of years. Because if you went back, say, 8 or 9 years, and he said to, when people were talking about the problems facing Britain, especially all the interlocking problems that come from immigration, or the EU for that matter, there's only one thing people would have said as they stared into their beer in despair. That was this: Enoch Powell was right. That's it, yeah? That's what they said. You've got it. The operative word is was. They weren't frightened of Enoch Powell was right, not in the least, because Enoch Powell was right, but Enoch Powell, God rest his soul, is dead. And Enoch Powell, in any case, never had a political party, a political machine to turn the anger of ordinary people and the concern of ordinary people and the hope of ordinary people for something better. He never had a machine to turn that into power, to turn it into reality. And on top of that, he was right. He's dead. And what scared them about us in the last few years, and most of all after the Question Time programme, when far from them thinking we were a toxic brand, they realised just how appealing our brand was. Because even our brand put through their mill, when I was only allowed to speak for a few small seconds, even that got us up to 24% of the opinion polls, just briefly when it was fresh in people's minds. They realised that we're not toxic. And what frightens them more than anything else, and created this hysterical attempt to destroy this party, which is now over but it hurt at the time, was the fear that what people would say is not Enoch Powell was right, but Nick Griffin is right. The British National Party is right. And the British National Party is here to help. Finally, in London, 3 things, because you look at London and think it's a demographic disaster area. You know, it's like Moss Side. It's like huge chunks of Manchester. So what can be done to turn things around? Well, there's 3 things that give me a great deal of hope that circumstances in London can change. 3 incidents. First of all, you may remember Ben Kinsella. He was a young lad, about 17, English lad, who was stabbed to death, probably Irish actually, I think, from the name, stabbed to death down in North London by a gang of young blacks. Now, you only remember him because his sister was some kind of actress. His death became a news story. Normally, if he's an ordinary white working class kid, it's simply swept under the carpet, buried. Little piece in the local paper about that big. Nothing racial about it, just an unfortunate incident. Bury the boy, bury the crime, bury the issue, forget about it. Ben Kinsella was a bit different, so some people have heard of his name. But what also came out a little bit was the fact there was quite a big campaign to commemorate him and to do something about the problem. Nothing was done, but there was a campaign on that issue. And in particular, his sister and a couple of her teenage friends went on Facebook and they said, we want to have a protest march, protest against knife crime. In about 3 days' time, it was that Saturday. And 3 days later, 1,000 youngsters turned up on the streets of North London. And they'd said, wear something white as a protest. And they all wore something white as a protest. Now, there's no political organisation in Britain, and there never has been, could mobilise 1,000 young people at 3 days' notice for a protest march. The National Union of Students can do it at 3 months' notice if they think they're going to get their student grants cut a bit or whatever. Then they can get them out. The English Defence League could mobilise several thousand at 2 or 3 months' notice. Some of them there absolutely committed to the cause, and some of them there just for a bit of fun and a bit of confrontation. But they could do that. But no one could mobilise 1,000 youngsters at 3 days' notice, especially with more than half of them being young girls. It's an astounding thing to do. And that was done with Facebook. And interestingly, although those kids came from basically the middle-class-ish schools, the yuppie schools of inner North London, they're schools which are 30, 40, 50% non-white, to use the BBC's term, not ours. And yet every single one of those protesters was white. Quite remarkable. So although no doubt they're all, or nearly all, perfectly brainwashed by the BBC and their school teachers and all the rest of it, nevertheless, in terms of what actually happened, there was a complete racial divide there between the protesters and the people who couldn't give a damn, between the protesters and the criminals, the ethnicity of the criminals. A black and white issue on the streets of North London. Very, very important for where things are in the future. The second thing, during the riots, the first couple of days in London, as for the rest of the country, everyone just sat and watched, appalled. Appalled primarily at the way the police just didn't do anything to stop the chaos. And they allowed small numbers of looters to tear the place apart and do what they damn well liked. Now, by the time it got to Salford, as you know, plenty of the rioters were homegrown English white trash. No question about it. And they need birching, and they need putting on some decent courses run by sergeant majors and terrified into becoming decent human beings instead of little scrunts. That's what they need. But in London, it wasn't white trash. In London, it was young blacks. Overwhelmingly black. And over the first couple of days, everyone just watched. And by day 3, first of all, the Turks, and then the Kurds, and then the Sikhs, and then the Muslims, they all came out, big groups of young men, to defend their area and their community from black mobs. And likewise, in the north of London in Enfield, in the south in Eltham, in the west in Dagenham, in the east in Dagenham, in the west in Feltham, big groups of young English men, British men, Londoners, came out to defend their community. And incidentally, also the Asian corner shop, which they regard as part of their community, and didn't want to see smashed up either, but they came out to defend it. And again, you had another Telegraph say, this is a great thing, this. It shows how all these different ethnic groups have brought into English law and order, and they're all there protecting the community. No, the Telegraph's horribly wrong. They were all there to protect their community. And rather than this being a sign of essential stability, it was a sign that London nearly slipped into civil war. Because one more little flashpoint, and those people would have attacked each other. When rioters are just looting a shop, the police have a very easy way of calming things down. Because once someone's got a 40-inch TV screen, they can't riot anymore. They stagger home with the bloody thing. Riot's over. It's far cheaper than getting a police car smashed up. That's the way they deal with those. If the police try and deal with a communal clash, whether it's Kurds against blacks, or Turks against blacks, or English against blacks, or Muslims against someone else, whatever it is, if they try and deal with that by pulling out, then instead of us going home, the two sides are likely to kill each other. And that's the stage that we are nearly at. And that shows, I'm not saying it's a good thing, I'm just saying that's how close it is to people in London and Manchester really having to turn to the British National Party, the people who warned about this. And the third point was, on the very tail end of those riots, the broom people came out. The good, middle-class type, respectable people, ordinary, decent people, shocked about what had happened to their area and coming out to sweep up the glass. And you look at the pictures of those broom people. They're all white, absolutely so. And most of them would be appalled at the idea that British National Party members have got that point and draw hope from it and inspiration from it. But nevertheless, when push comes to shove, if you've got a broom, there's not much difference between sweeping up the glass and using the broom handle for something else. And that's where London is now, and it's why it's so important that we can win that seat in London. I believe we can do it because, Manchester's not very far behind London, for that matter either. It's not our last chance, but it's not very far off being our last chance. So finally, again, coming back to London, as it all goes wrong. Remember Diane Abbott? Diane Abbott. And this sums up the Labour Party all over, including in Manchester. There she was. She got a huge amount of stick recently for saying that white people play divide and rule. Now that alone is racist and wrong and puts a big chip on young black shoulders against white people. which is liable to lead to them thinking, yeah, I can commit a crime against that white family or that old lady because it's not really a crime. I'm hitting back for the way they are because they try and divide and rule us and they're guilty of slavery and all the rest of it. But for that, she got a fair bit of stick, and so she should have done. But she got no stick at all from the political elite for the other thing she said, which was, as the recession bites, the English people, the white people, should be out of the job and the blacks have got to keep the jobs. And that's the position that we are in. Not that a crazed, hate-filled Labour politician thinks that and says it, but the fact that when they say it, they don't really get much stick for it. It's basically already accepted as being something, yeah, it's probably the best way to buy peace. That is why our people need someone to stand up for them. There is nobody else. And that is why there was this desperate attempt to destroy this party over the last couple of years, which has now failed, and now it's our job to get out there and to show people that, yes, we are alive, we are kicking, we are fighting back for our people, and we are winning. Thank you very much.